When Claire and I returned to our childhood home to sort through our late mother's things, we expected memories. Not secrets. But a locked drawer, a forgotten letter, and a name we'd never heard unraveled everything we thought we knew about family love and the cost of silence. I never expected to come back to the house on the hill after all those years away, yet there I was standing at the edge of the driveway, staring up at the faded blue paint peeling in long strips from the siding and wondering how a place that once felt so alive could look this hollow. The windows reflected nothing but the gray sky and the bare branches around them, and the silence that hung over everything made the air feel thick like it was holding its breath. I could still remember how the front porch used to creak under my father's boots when he came home from work, and how my mother would hum while she watered the hydrangeas that lined the fence. Now the boards were warped, the flowers long gone, and the smell of rain mixed with old wood carried a strange kind of sadness that settled deep in my chest. The house had been empty since Mom passed 2 years ago, but somehow it didn't feel abandoned, it felt like it was waiting. My sister Claire had called a week ago, saying we needed to meet and go through Mom's things before the estate sale. Her tone was brisk, efficient, the way it always was when she was trying to keep her emotions locked behind a wall of practicality. I agreed to come mostly because I didn't want her to do it alone, but partly because I couldn't shake the feeling that there were still questions buried in that house that never got answered. Growing up here had felt normal at the time, though looking back there were cracks in the picture we never dared to touch. When I stepped through the door, the smell of old dust and lemon polish hit me at once. The hallway looked smaller than I remembered, the wallpaper yellowed and curling near the edges. Every step I took echoed faintly down the corridor as if the place was listening. Claire was in the kitchen wearing her usual neat gray sweater, her dark hair tied back like she was going to an office meeting rather than sorting through memories. She gave me a quick smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and pointed to the table where she'd already stacked boxes labeled with black marker. Kitchenware, photos, papers, attic, miscellaneous. Always organized, always prepared, that was Claire. She said we should start with the study because Mom had kept most of her paperwork there. The study was our father's old domain before he left when I was 13 and Claire was 16. He'd been gone 20 years now and we still didn't know where he ended up. Mom used to tell people he ran off to chase a business venture, but Claire and I knew that was just something she said to avoid gossip. After he left, she changed in quiet ways. She stopped playing music in the evenings and started locking the study door. Whenever we asked about Dad, she'd just say that some things were better left alone. Claire and I spent the first hour sorting through stacks of bills and letters, mostly mundane things, until I found an envelope at the bottom of a drawer that had my name written on it in Mom's handwriting. The paper was brittle and the ink slightly faded but unmistakable. I froze holding it for a moment before Claire noticed. She raised an eyebrow and asked what it was. I told her I didn't know, and she shrugged and went back to her stack, though I could feel her eyes flicking toward me every few seconds. I slipped the envelope into my pocket, deciding to read it later when I was alone. Something about it made me uneasy, maybe because Mom never wrote letters, she preferred to talk or not talk at all. As the day went on, the rain outside turned heavier and the sound of it hitting the roof gave the house a rhythm. We worked mostly in silence until Claire found a small wooden box tucked behind a row of old cookbooks. It was locked with a tiny brass latch and covered in dust. She held it up and said she didn't remember ever seeing it before. I didn't either. It was the kind of box you'd expect to hold jewelry or maybe keepsakes, but it had a weight to it that felt more serious. We both stared at it for a long time, neither of us eager to be the one to open it. When we finally pried the latch open, the smell of old paper and cedar drifted out. Inside were letters, photographs, and a folded document that looked like a birth certificate, but the name printed on it wasn't mine or Claire's. It was a boy's name I had never heard before. Claire went pale and I could hear her breathing quicken, though she didn't say anything. The date on the certificate was only a year before I was born, which meant if it was real, our mother had another child she never told us about. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The rain drummed harder against the windows and the house seemed to hum faintly, like it was aware that something had shifted. I looked at Claire, expecting her to say something rational, to brush it off or find an explanation, but she just stared at the paper with that same hollow look Mom used to have when we asked about Dad. It was the look of someone who knew more than they were willing to say. That was when I realized this wasn't just a matter of sorting through old memories. There was something else here, something my mother had tried to bury long before she passed. I felt the weight of the envelope in my pocket and knew it probably held part of the answer, but I wasn't sure if I was ready to read it yet. The house had waited years to tell its story, and I had the uneasy feeling that once I opened that letter there'd be no turning back. I carried the wooden box to the study desk while the storm rattled the gutter, and I set it down beside the neat stacks of papers that Claire had already sorted, and for a moment I just looked at it like it might explain itself if I stared long enough, though of course it did not, and the weight of the sealed envelope in my pocket kept reminding me that answers were not going to offer themselves without a little courage on my part, which has never been my most abundant resource. I told Claire that I wanted a few minutes to breathe, and she nodded in that way she has where every nod feels like a verdict, and she drifted off to the kitchen to make tea using the same dented kettle that used to scream on winter mornings when we were late for school. I took the envelope out and slid a finger under the edge, and the paper opened with a soft rasp that seemed louder than the rain, and inside there was a single sheet written in a careful hand that I recognized from grocery lists fixed to the fridge with a weak magnet that always let the paper slither to the floor. The letter was not long, yet every sentence felt heavy and patient, like it had been waiting its turn. Our mother wrote that before I was born she had a son with a man she did not marry, and that this son had been placed with another family in a small town 2 hours north, and that later she met our father and tried to start clean, though the past kept tugging at her sleeve like a child who will not be ignored. She wrote that the boy's name was Drew, and that he had gray eyes and a quiet way even as a baby, which sounded like the kind of detail you only remember when the memory hurts to hold. She did not say why she kept this from us, and she did not say whether our father knew, though she hinted that secrets can become a kind of glue when a household is cracking, and that telling the truth can sometimes shatter what little is left. At the end she asked whoever read the letter to forgive her, which felt like a request placed on a table between strangers who are not sure who should pick it up. I sat there listening to the kettle begin its thin whistle while my mind raced in that slow stumbling way it does when a truth knocks the air out of you, and my first thought was that this explained the locked study and the forbidden questions and the way she watched the mailman like he might be carrying a verdict. My second thought was less noble and more practical, which was that I have 2 kids waiting at home for dinner and a homework check and a reminder to brush their teeth because their mother is 3 time zones away chasing a job that pays less than mine by a wide stretch while calling it a dream that could not fit in our town. She had left 2 months ago saying we would all be stronger for it, and that she would fly back often, though the flights kept getting delayed by real life, and I found myself learning the choreography of solo parenting with more grace than I expected and less sleep than I would recommend. Claire came back with 2 chipped mugs and a look that said she was ready to dissect whatever I found, and I told her the gist of the letter without reading it aloud because something about my mother's handwriting felt like a voice that should not be performed. Claire listened with her arms folded and her stare fixed on the wooden box as if it might burn a hole through the desk, and then she said in that measured tone she uses when delivering a budget that she had suspected there was someone else all along because she once found a photograph of Mom holding a baby that was not me and not her, and when she asked about it Mom said it was a cousin's child and then hid the picture inside a book about gardening that none of us ever read. She admitted that she had never pushed because pushing had never worked in this house, and because secrets here behaved like stubborn weeds that sprout again the moment you turn your back. There was a folded map under the letters, and Claire unfolded it and pointed to a name circled in blue pen, and the circle sat over a lakeside town I recognized from highway signs and bait shop billboards back when our father liked to fish more than he liked to talk. Tucked with the map was a bus ticket stub with a date from 12 years ago, and for a second I imagined our mother walking down a quiet street with that careful stride she had when she was trying not to slip on ice, except it would have been summer then, and the air would have smelled like gasoline and pine. If she went north after Dad left then, she might have seen Drew as a young man and returned without telling us, and all at once I felt foolish for thinking I had ever understood her silences. The house groaned as a gust pushed rain under the eaves, and Claire said we should drive up there soon and see what we find, and I agreed because neither of us could pretend that curiosity would settle on its own, and also because the longer I stayed away from home, the more I worried about my 2 kids negotiating bedtime treaties that would surely favor chaos. On the drive back I called their mother and told her I might need to take a day to handle family matters, and she sounded distracted by office noise and new colleagues and explained that a visit home was impossible before next month, and I said that was fine because I have developed a voice that makes everything sound fine even when it is not. When I reached my place the house smelled like peanut butter and dry markers, which meant the kids had made their own sandwiches and attempted a poster for a science project that had something to do with weather balloons, though the balloons were drawn like enormous grapes floating over a city. I tucked them in and lay awake on the couch with the letter on my chest, watching the ceiling fan turn slowly and thinking about the boy with gray eyes who would now be older than me by a year, and I wished I could ask my mother why she kept that part of her life folded into a cedar box instead of tucking it into our daily story where it would have breathed like everything else. I eventually slept and dreamed of a lake road that turned in on itself like a spiral, and I woke up with the taste of rain in my mouth and the certainty that Claire and I would drive north, because sometimes the only way to respect a secret is to meet it face to face and then decide whether to carry it forward or lay it down. The drive north took longer than I expected, though the sky cleared after the first hour, leaving the road washed and glinting in places where the sunlight broke through the trees. Claire sat in the passenger seat with a notebook on her lap filled with lists and dates and half-formed questions. She always did that. When she was nervous, she would write everything down, as if organization could wrestle uncertainty into submission. I kept my eyes on the asphalt, watching the faint steam rise from the damp surface, and trying to ignore the way my hands tightened on the steering wheel whenever I thought about the letter folded in my jacket pocket. I had read it 3 times now, and every word felt heavier each time. It wasn't just the idea that our mother had a secret child, it was the realization that she had chosen to carry that secret through an entire lifetime of holidays, dinners, and small talk without letting a single hint slip. The road narrowed as we approached the Lake District. The pines grew denser and their needles turned the air sharp with that cold green scent that always reminds me of early mornings before fishing trips. We passed an old diner with a rusted sign, and I remembered stopping there once as a kid when Dad was still around. I mentioned it to Claire, but she didn't respond. She was staring out the window, lost in thought, and I could tell she was building theories in her head. She has always been like that. Even as a teenager, she believed that every puzzle had an answer if you just looked hard enough. I used to envy that certainty. We reached the town around noon. It wasn't much more than a cluster of buildings around a square with a grocery store, a church, and a post office. The lake shimmered behind them, calm and gray like a mirror that had forgotten how to reflect. I parked near the diner, which was still open despite its weary appearance. Inside, it smelled like coffee and bacon grease, and there was a radio humming somewhere behind the counter. We ordered 2 coffees and asked the waitress about the address written on the back of the map. She glanced at it and said it was out near the east side, near the old boathouse road. She asked if we were visiting family. I said maybe. She nodded in that polite small-town way that means she won't ask further, but she'll remember our faces just in case. The drive to the address took us along a gravel road bordered by birch trees. The number on the mailbox was faded, but it matched the one on the map. The house beyond it was small, a single story with peeling paint and a screened porch. There was a pickup truck parked out front and a stack of firewood near the door. As we approached, I could feel Claire's tension in the air like static. She wanted to knock immediately, but I hesitated. What exactly were we going to say? Hello, we think our mother might have been your mother too. It sounded absurd even in my head. Still, curiosity has a way of pushing reason aside. I climbed the steps and knocked. A man opened the door. He looked to be in his early 40s, though something about his face made me pause. The shape of his eyes was familiar, not identical, but close enough to stir something inside me. He looked at us with cautious politeness and asked if he could help. Claire introduced us and said we were looking for someone named Drew. His expression shifted slightly before he said that was him. There was a beat of silence where none of us knew how to start. Claire finally explained that our mother's name was Evelyn and that she had passed away recently. The man's shoulders dropped as if a weight had landed on them. He asked us to come inside. The living room was simple but tidy, with bookshelves filled with old paperbacks and photographs of what looked like fishing trips. He offered us coffee, and we accepted, mostly for something to do with our hands. When Claire explained how we found the birth certificate and the letter, his eyes stayed fixed on the window. After a moment, he said he always wondered if she would send someone one day. He told us he had grown up knowing he was adopted, but his adoptive parents had died years ago without ever telling him much about his birth mother. A few years back, he hired someone to find her, but they couldn't locate anything beyond an old address that no longer existed. He had given up until now. Listening to him talk felt strange because he sounded calm, yet there was a flicker of something deeper in his voice, like restrained relief mixed with anger. I found myself studying his face, looking for my own features reflected somewhere. Though it wasn't resemblance that connected us, it was the quiet tone. When he spoke, the same tone Mom used whenever she tried to apologize for things she couldn't name. Claire asked if he ever met our father, and he shook his head. He said all he knew was that his birth certificate listed only our mother's name, and that she had once sent a small box through the mail when he turned 18. Inside, it was a silver key on a ribbon and a note that said, "For when you're ready." He never figured out what it meant. Claire looked at me then, and I could see her mind racing through possibilities, but I just kept staring at the key he had placed on the table. It was simple, tarnished, but somehow familiar. I remembered something from childhood, a drawer in our mother's bedroom that was always locked and a silver key that hung from a hook near her dresser. I had never seen her use it, but she always made sure it stayed there. If it was the same key, then whatever it opened wasn't in this house but back home in the one that still sat waiting on the hill. We spent another hour talking mostly about small things. Drew told us he worked as a mechanic at the local garage and that he liked the quiet life near the lake. He didn't ask for details about Mom's death, and I didn't volunteer any. When we finally left, he said we were welcome to visit again anytime, though his tone made it clear he didn't expect we would. As we walked back to the car, Claire whispered that she wanted to go through the old house once more before the sale, maybe that locked drawer was still there. I agreed, though part of me wished we could leave things as they were. On the way back, the sky darkened again and the first drops began to fall on the windshield. I kept thinking about the look on Drew's face when we told him who we were and how it was both recognition and distance, like seeing a reflection through fog. I wondered if Mom ever drove this same road years ago and whether she felt relief or regret when she left it behind. Whatever she hid inside that drawer might finally tell us why she kept silent all those years. Yet deep down I wasn't sure I wanted to know, because every answer so far had rewritten pieces of my life I thought were settled, and I was starting to realize that some truths don't free you, they just change the shape of the cage. When we reached the main highway, Claire was already planning our next trip back to the old house, and I could hear the faint edge of determination in her voice. I didn't tell her that part of me feared what we might find locked away waiting for that silver key. When we returned to the old house the next morning, the air was heavy with mist that clung to the trees and turned the driveway into a narrow gray ribbon that seemed to disappear into nothing. Claire unlocked the door while I stood by the car trying to steady myself. Something about coming back after meeting Drew made the house feel different, almost hostile, like it knew we had disturbed the order of things. Inside, the air smelled faintly of damp wood and thyme. The walls seemed to hold their breath, waiting for us to uncover whatever came next. Claire walked straight down the hallway without a word, as if her feet already knew where to go. I followed her past the faded pictures of birthdays and school days that hung slightly crooked, as though gravity itself had grown tired of keeping them straight. Mom's bedroom door creaked when I pushed it open. The curtains were drawn, and the light that filtered through was soft and pale, turning the room into a quiet museum of her habits. The dresser stood against the far wall, its surface still cluttered with old perfume bottles and a hairbrush that still held a few strands of her silver hair. Claire opened drawers with quick, deliberate motions until she reached the bottom one, which refused to budge. The keyhole sat just above the handle, and I felt the air tighten around us. Without a word, I took the small silver key from my pocket, and it slid into the lock as if it had been waiting for years. When the drawer opened, the faint scent of lavender and paper drifted out, the same scent that used to hang on her clothes after she ironed them on Sunday evenings. Inside were neatly stacked envelopes tied together with twine and a faded photograph on top. The picture showed our mother standing beside a man near the lake, the same lake we had just visited. His arm was around her shoulders, and he looked nothing like our father. His smile was wide, but hers was hesitant, the kind of smile that hides more than it shows. Behind them was a small cabin half hidden by trees. Claire stared at it for a long time, then turned the photo over. Written on the back in Mom's looping handwriting were the words, "Our first summer with you." The ink had bled slightly, but it was clear enough. Claire's eyes widened, and she whispered that maybe you meant Drew. We untied the stack of envelopes and found that most of them were addressed to him. They were dated across 20 years, every few months, like a heartbeat stretching through time. I picked one at random and read a few lines. She had written about ordinary things: the weather, the garden, the way the hydrangeas refused to bloom that year. But beneath it there was an ache so raw it was almost visible between the lines. She told him she thought of him every day but couldn't reach out openly without risking something important. She never mentioned what that something was. Claire sank onto the bed, holding a handful of letters against her chest. I could see her trying to piece together the timeline, her mind ticking through dates and memories, but the math only deepened the confusion. Our father left when I was 13, but these letters went on long after that, meaning Mom had been writing to Drew even after we thought she'd cut all ties. I kept digging through the drawer until I found a small bundle of photos wrapped in tissue. They were all taken at the same cabin by the lake. Drew as a boy sitting on a wooden dock. Our mother standing beside him. Another man in several of them, the same man from the first photo, sometimes smiling, sometimes looking away from the camera as if caught off guard. In one picture, he was holding a baby that looked eerily like me. My heart stuttered as I studied it because the child couldn't have been Drew. The dates didn't match. Claire leaned over my shoulder and went pale when she saw it. She whispered that the baby's birth date written on the back was just a year after mine. That didn't make sense, yet there it was in her handwriting. Summer, the year after. It took me a moment to realize what she was suggesting. If that baby wasn't me or Drew, then there had been another. Another brother or sister hidden even deeper under her silence. Claire shook her head, refusing to believe it, but her face betrayed something else. Fear maybe, or recognition. She reached for another letter and began scanning through lines until she found one that made her inhale sharply. Mom had written, "He doesn't know about the baby. I couldn't tell him after what happened at the lake." Claire looked up, her eyes wide and wet. She asked what I thought it meant, but I didn't have an answer. I tried to picture our mother younger, standing on that dock with the wind in her hair and a secret in her arms, wondering which part of her life she could afford to lose. The realization crept in slowly but firmly, that the man in the photos wasn't just some passing figure. He was part of a life she had built before and after our father. The letters weren't just messages to a son. They were her way of keeping a promise she'd never been able to keep out loud. We spent hours reading through the rest, and the more we read, the clearer it became that our mother had led two lives tangled together by guilt and necessity. She had visited Drew every summer until something happened at the lake that ended it all. The last letter ended abruptly mid-sentence, as if she'd been interrupted. There was a dark smudge near the edge of the page that might have been ink or something else. Claire said she couldn't stand to read anymore and left the room to get air, leaving me alone with the drawer half open and the rain starting again outside. I stared at the photograph of the cabin for a long time before noticing a faint set of coordinates written in pencil on the back corner. They were barely visible but clear enough when held under the lamp. It struck me then that maybe Mom had left them as a kind of breadcrumb trail, knowing one day someone would follow. I felt that same unease from before tightening around me because the secret no longer felt like a story from the past. It felt unfinished, as if we had stepped into the middle of something that was still alive. When Claire returned, her face was pale but her voice was steady. She said we had come this far and couldn't stop now. She wanted to drive to those coordinates. I started to protest, but she cut me off, saying it was the only way to understand what our mother had been running from. The air between us felt heavy, but I knew she was right. Whatever waited at that cabin might hold the truth not only about Drew but also about the baby in the photograph and the reason our mother locked this drawer for the rest of her life. Outside, the rain turned to a slow drizzle and the clouds began to break apart, letting through a thin band of orange light. The road to the lake was long and winding, but as I looked at Claire's determined expression, I realized that curiosity was no longer the only thing driving us. There was a quiet sense of duty now, a need to give shape to our mother's silence before it swallowed everything else. What none of us knew then was that the truth waiting by that lake would not simply explain her choices. It would force us to question everything we thought we knew about our own beginnings. The road to the lake stretched narrow and uneven through woods that grew denser with every mile, and though the afternoon light had already begun to fade, neither of us spoke, because there was nothing left to say that would make the drive any shorter or the anticipation any lighter. Claire held the photograph with the coordinates written on the back while I followed the route on my phone, but reception kept fading and the map glitched until finally the blue dot froze altogether, which somehow felt appropriate. It seemed that wherever we were headed was not meant to be tracked by modern devices. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and I could hear gravel crunch beneath the tires like the sound of bones shifting deep in the soil. When we finally reached the turnoff, the trees opened into a clearing, and the cabin appeared at the far end, just as it had in the photographs, though older, smaller, and leaning slightly as if the years had weighed unevenly upon its frame. The paint had long peeled away, leaving only gray wood and patches of moss climbing the sides. A single window faced the lake where the water was still except for the occasional ripple from a drifting leaf. For a long moment we simply stood there taking it in because the place carried that eerie calm of something once loved and then forgotten. I half expected the door to swing open on its own, and for our mother to step out as she had been in those photos, young, uncertain, and holding something fragile in her hands. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and old rain-soaked wood. The first floor was one open room with a small kitchenette, a sagging couch, and a wood stove streaked with rust. Cobwebs hung from the beams like faded drapery, and in one corner stood a trunk covered in a tarp. Claire pulled the tarp away and coughed as the dust rose. The trunk was heavy and locked with a clasp, though this time no keyhole, just a simple latch that gave way when she pressed her weight against it. Inside were stacks of newspapers dated decades back and bundles of photographs tied together with twine. The earliest newspaper on top carried a headline about a local boating accident that had claimed the life of one man and left another missing, presumed drowned. The date was the same summer marked on the back of the photograph we had found in Mom's drawer. Claire read the article aloud, and as she did, the story began to stitch itself to everything we already knew. A couple vacationing near the lake had rented a boat one afternoon. Witnesses saw it drift too far from shore before a sudden storm hit and the boat overturned. Only the woman was found alive, though in shock, unable to speak for several days. The man's body was never recovered. The names were not printed, but the description of the woman's age and hometown were enough. It had to be our mother. Claire's voice trembled as she reached the final paragraph, which mentioned how the woman had since left town with an infant in her care. I felt my throat tighten. An infant in her care. Not necessarily her own. Not necessarily Drew. The realization came slowly that perhaps the baby she brought home after that summer was me. It would explain the faint differences that relatives sometimes pointed out when comparing my features to our father's and the uneasy silences that followed those remarks. It would explain the locked drawer, the secret letters, and why our mother clung so fiercely to quiet routine, as if afraid noise itself might unravel her story. Claire sat down hard on the couch, staring at the floor. She whispered that she remembered Dad once joking that I was too calm to be his child, that maybe the milkman had slipped into the picture. We both half smiled at the memory, but it dissolved quickly under the weight of what we were now considering. I wandered through the rest of the cabin, searching for something concrete among the ghosts. The bedroom at the back was small, with a single narrow bed and a shelf lined with a few books swollen from damp. On the wall hung a framed photograph of the lake at sunset. I pulled it down because the frame looked newer than everything else. Behind it, taped to the wall, was a thin envelope. Inside were two things: a short note written in our mother's careful slant and a faded hospital wristband. The note said, "For the one who comes after. You were loved, though not by the one who gave you life, but by the one who chose you instead. Forgive me for the years of silence. It was the only way to keep you safe." The words made my knees weak. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the wristband, which had a name smudged almost beyond recognition, though the few letters that remained matched the man in the newspaper article. It was his child, the baby she brought back, the baby she raised as her own. The missing man had been my biological father. Claire stood in the doorway, pale and quiet, as she read over my shoulder. She didn't speak for a long time. Then she said something that startled me with its simple honesty. She said that nothing changed who I was or who we had been to each other, and that Mom must have carried her silence out of love, not shame. I wanted to believe that, but I kept seeing the water, the overturned boat, the infant rescued from a storm that had stolen one life and rewritten another. I imagined our mother returning home carrying that baby, while our father waited, unaware that the child in her arms belonged to someone who would never be found. It made sense now why he left years later. Maybe he discovered the truth and could not bear it, or maybe she confessed in a moment of exhaustion, and he walked out rather than carry a lie that heavy. The mystery of his disappearance suddenly felt smaller next to the enormity of hers. Claire and I gathered the photographs and the note and stepped outside. The sun was sinking low, painting the lake in muted orange. I watched the ripples spread across the water and wondered if somewhere beneath that surface lay the man whose life had crossed ours before it even began. The air was cool and smelled faintly of pine and decay. Claire said we should take the documents back to Drew because he deserved to know. I nodded, though my mind drifted to my own children at home, blissfully unaware of how fragile identity can be. As we drove away, the cabin disappeared behind the trees and the road curved along the shoreline. I looked back once and thought I saw a flash of light on the water, like a reflection of something unseen, and for a second I understood why our mother never spoke of it. Some truths live better in silence because saying them out loud makes the world tilt in ways that cannot be undone. Claire rested her head against the window, her eyes closed, as if already carrying the weight of what awaited us next. And though I didn't say it out loud, I knew the hardest part was still ahead, because telling Drew what we had found would mean acknowledging that the family we thought we knew was built on borrowed time and borrowed blood. We drove through the dark with the trunk of my car full of boxes that rattled with every turn, and neither of us said much because words had started to lose their usefulness. The headlights caught the mist hanging low over the fields, and sometimes the branches of trees leaned so close over the road that it felt like we were passing through a tunnel built by shadows. Claire kept her arms folded tight across her chest and her eyes on the narrow beam of light ahead, and I knew she was thinking the same thing I was. What do you even say to a man when you have to tell him that the mother who gave him up also stole a child that wasn't hers and raised it as her own? The next morning we met Drew at the diner near the square. He was sitting by the window wearing the same gray jacket as before, and when he saw us he smiled politely, but his eyes stayed wary. I could tell he already sensed that whatever brought us back wasn't simple. Claire started explaining everything right there in the booth because she has never been good at waiting for privacy. She laid the photograph on the table, then the note, then the hospital wristband. Drew looked at each one slowly, and for a long time he didn't speak. The waitress came by and asked if we wanted more coffee, and none of us answered, so she refilled the cups quietly and slipped away. When Drew finally spoke, his voice was calm, but his hand trembled slightly. He said that he remembered his adoptive parents telling him that his birth mother had been young and scared, and that the man involved had drowned before he was born. Hearing that part of it was true seemed to give him no comfort at all. He stared out the window toward the lake that glittered faintly through the fog and said that he had always felt an odd pull toward the water, and maybe this was why. Claire told him that our father left a few years after I was born, and that we never knew the reason, but now it was clear. Drew didn't say anything to that either. He just nodded slowly, as if each piece of information was a stone being placed on a scale he couldn't yet balance. I told him that I didn't know how to apologize for something that happened before I existed, but that I was sorry anyway because the silence that protected me had hurt him. He looked at me, and for the first time there was something almost brotherly in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. He said none of us owed anyone an apology because the only person who could have explained everything was gone, and maybe she had done what she thought she had to. Then he asked if he could keep the note and the wristband. Claire hesitated but handed them over. After that, we just sat there listening to the low murmur of the diner. At one point, Drew asked if we had gone through the rest of the trunk because he thought there might be something else hidden underneath the newspapers. I told him we hadn't looked that deep. His voice was steady when he suggested we all go back together, one last time, and finish what we started. I didn't want to, but Claire agreed immediately, and I could see that refusal would only make the tension worse. The afternoon light was cold and pale when we reached the cabin again. Inside, the air felt heavier, like the house itself remembered us. Drew pulled away the remaining stacks of newspapers while Claire searched along the walls, and I lifted the floorboards near the stove because I remembered seeing a slight gap earlier. Beneath the boards was a tin box sealed tight with rust but not locked. Inside were only 2 items: a letter addressed to whoever finds this, and a small bundle wrapped in cloth. The letter was written in the same careful hand as the one we'd found before. It said that the bundle contained the deed to the cabin and a journal belonging to the man who had drowned. She wrote that she had kept them hidden so that one day when her children were old enough they could decide what to do with the truth instead of having it forced upon them as it had been forced upon her. I unwrapped the bundle carefully. Inside was a thin leather journal swollen from moisture. The first page began with the man's name, the same name from the hospital wristband, and the entries were dated across one summer. He wrote about meeting a woman named Evelyn who was staying nearby with her young son. He described their long talks by the water, the way she laughed despite carrying some heavy sadness, and how one night a storm rolled in fast and he tried to row her and the baby back to shore, but the boat overturned. His last entry ended mid-sentence, the ink washed out by water stains. Reading it made my stomach twist because I could picture the scene exactly as our mother must have lived it. The flash of lightning, the panic, the cold weight of guilt afterward. I understood now why she locked the drawer and why she kept writing letters she could never send. It wasn't just shame. It was penance. She had taken in his child and raised it as her own, maybe out of love, maybe out of remorse, maybe both. Drew took the journal in his hands and traced the handwriting with his thumb. He said quietly that this man had been his adoptive father's cousin, and that maybe that was how the adoption had come to be, an arrangement to keep the scandal contained. It made sense. Claire looked at me then and said softly that our mother hadn't just hidden a child. She had tried to build a bridge between two families that would never meet, and in doing so she had bound us all together in a knot no one could untangle. We stood there for a long time while dust drifted in the slant of light through the window. Finally Drew said he wanted to keep the cabin. He said it felt like a place where all the versions of our mother could finally rest together. Claire agreed, and for once she didn't try to make a list or a plan. She just nodded. When we left the lake that evening the sun was already sinking and the water glowed faintly gold. I watched the reflection of the sky ripple in the rearview mirror until the road curved and the trees swallowed it again. Claire leaned her head against the window and said that we had done what we came to do. I wasn't sure if I believed her. Some stories don't end when you find the truth. They just keep echoing quietly through everything that follows. And as I drove back toward the life waiting for me, the children, the bills, the ordinary rhythm of mornings and nights, I couldn't shake the feeling that our mother had known exactly how this would unfold. She had left us a trail not to burden us, but to make sure that one day we would find one another. The secret had finally come full circle, yet its shadow lingered, soft and unspoken, like the hush that follows a confession whispered too late. The weeks after that trip felt strangely weightless, as if something that had held my life in place had finally loosened its grip and left everything quietly shifting in its absence. Claire and I returned home to the Hill House for what we both agreed would be the last time. The estate sale was already set and a crew was coming the following morning to empty out what was left. We walked through each room slowly, letting the dust rise around our steps, and it struck me how much lighter the air seemed now that the secrets had been named. The silence no longer felt watchful, just tired, as though the house had done its job and could finally rest. Claire went upstairs to box the last of the clothes while I wandered to the back porch. The sky was pale and high and the trees along the fence swayed lazily in the wind. I could still smell the faint sweetness of hydrangeas even though the bushes had long since withered. For the first time in months my thoughts weren't racing. I thought about Drew still living near the lake repairing old engines and spending weekends restoring the cabin. He had called once after we left to say, he found a half-finished painting behind the stove panel, a watercolor of a small child standing by the water holding a toy boat. On the back she had written for both of my sons. He said he was going to frame it. I told him I thought that was right. When Claire came down she was holding one last item from Mom's dresser, a small glass paperweight shaped like a tear with a single bubble trapped in its center. She said it had always sat there but she'd never really noticed it. I held it up to the light, and for a moment the sunlight caught the bubble and made it look like something suspended mid-flight, refusing to rise or fall. It reminded me of her entire life, that delicate balance between what she revealed and what she kept hidden. Claire smiled faintly and said we should each take one thing to remember her by, something that wasn't heavy with meaning. I chose the paperweight. She took Mom's old gardening shears, still dull with rust. The following weekend I drove back to my own house where my kids were waiting. The moment I walked in they both shouted over each other, trying to tell me about school and friends and everything I had missed, and I realized how grateful I was for the noise. It was ordinary, it was alive, and it filled the space in a way silence never could. That night, after they fell asleep, I sat by the window holding the paperweight and thinking about all the versions of my mother we had uncovered. There was the young woman by the lake, the grieving one who locked her secrets away, the steady parent who raised us on routines and patience, and the aging woman who still hummed while watering the garden, as if that small song could keep time itself at bay. Each version was true, none of them complete. A week later a letter arrived in the mail without a return address, but I knew it was from Drew. Inside was a photograph of the cabin, newly painted and standing straighter than before, with fresh boards nailed to the porch and wildflowers planted along the edge. On the back he had written a single line, "The lake is calm again." I read it twice and felt something in me ease. Maybe he meant the water, maybe he meant all of us. Claire and I spoke on the phone that night. She told me she had started writing down the story, not to publish or share, but just to understand it for herself. She said she wanted to make sure her children would one day know who their grandmother was without judgment, just truth. I told her that seemed like the only right way to end it. We didn't talk about visiting the cabin again, though we both knew we would eventually. There are some places you return to not for closure, but to remember that questions can sometimes sit beside answers peacefully. On my last visit to the cemetery, I brought a small jar of lake water that Drew had sent with the photograph. I poured it gently over her grave, watching it soak into the soil and disappear. I didn't say much, only that we had found him, and that he was doing well, and that I understood now why she had chosen silence. Sometimes love hides not to deceive but to protect the fragile things that cannot survive exposure. The wind moved softly through the grass, and I could almost hear her voice again, faint like the rustle of leaves, reminding me to keep going, to take care of what's mine, to let the rest drift away. As I walked back to the car, the paperweight shifted in my pocket and caught the sun. For a moment the light scattered into a dozen tiny reflections on the ground, each one trembling and vanishing before I could step on it. It made me think about how every family carries its own hidden geometry of loss and love, and how truth, when it finally comes to light, does not destroy those patterns, it just reveals the threads that were always there, binding everything quietly together. I started the engine and glanced at the house in the mirror one last time. The windows were still empty, but they no longer looked hollow. They looked at peace. Driving down the hill, I felt the steady rhythm of the road beneath me and thought about how every story ends in motion, not silence. Maybe that was the gift she meant to leave us. Not an answer or an apology, but the freedom to move forward without the weight of mystery pressing down. I took a deep breath and let the past settle behind me like dust in sunlight, soft and harmless at last.